The Chiron Exodus fleet drifted through the dark like a wounded memory of a dying civilization. 17 ships remained from what had once been a proud interstellar armada capable of shaping entire star systems. Now their hulls were scarred, their engines flickered weakly, and their internal systems struggled to keep life from slipping away. Inside the command vessel, Erebus Hope, Commander Lyra Venn stood motionless before a holographic display that blinked warnings faster than her officers could silence them. The air inside the bridge was heavy with recycled oxygen and heavier silence. Every breath felt borrowed, every heartbeat felt counted. Officer Dren finally spoke, his voice controlled but tight with exhaustion, reporting that life support could last no more than 9 standard days under current conditions. Perhaps 11 if non-essential systems were sacrificed entirely. No one responded immediately, because everyone understood what that meant. 9 days was not time. It was an ending with delay. Lyra closed her eyes briefly, not in surrender, but calculation. Her species had survived extinction once before, when their home star destabilized without warning and consumed entire worlds in expanding waves of radiation. The evacuation had been chaotic, incomplete, and desperate. Millions had died before the fleet ever launched. What remained of their civilization had been packed into these ships, carrying knowledge, culture, memory, and fear across the void in search of sanctuary that had never appeared. Then came the anomaly that changed everything. A gravitational shear field had torn through their trajectory, shattering faster than light drives, and severing them from every known navigational route. Since then, they had been drifting, unable to turn back, unable to move forward, and slowly running out of time. Science Officer Elios Mar stood near the tactical console, his hands hovering over readings that made little sense even to him. After a long silence, he finally spoke, stating that he had detected structured electromagnetic signals from a nearby star system. The readings were not random cosmic noise. They were organized, layered, and repeating in patterns that suggested intelligence. The entire bridge shifted subtly at that revelation. Hope, long suppressed, flickered dangerously in the room. Lyra turned slowly and asked for confirmation. Elios hesitated before replying that multiple planetary bodies in that system were broadcasting signals indicating large-scale technological infrastructure. This was not a primitive world. It was advanced, possibly even spacefaring. The word possibly carried weight because it implied uncertainty, and uncertainty had killed more civilizations than war. The Chiron had learned this through painful history. Every contact with alien civilizations had ended poorly. Some demanded resources they could not give. Others opened fire before communication could begin. A few simply ignored their distress entirely, leaving them to drift past salvation. Trust was not instinct anymore. It was risk. Lyra made her decision anyway. A scout probe was prepared and launched silently from the fleet, its engines burning low and efficient, conserving every particle of fuel as it accelerated toward the signal source. Inside the probe, pilot Cale Rin watched the stars stretch forward like fractures in reality, each second carrying them further from safety or return. Elios sat behind him, monitoring incoming data streams. The silence between them was heavy, but not empty. It was filled with expectation they did not dare name. After 3 days of travel, they entered the system. The first sight was enough to silence both of them completely. A yellow star burned steadily at the center, surrounded by 8 planets. But it was the third planet that dominated all attention. It was blue and green, alive with oceans, continents, and cloud systems that moved like breathing patterns across its surface. But what truly stunned them was not the planet itself. It was what surrounded it. Thousands of artificial structures orbited in coordinated systems. Satellites, stations, orbital platforms, and energy grids formed a web of technological presence around the world. This civilization had not only survived its own evolution, it had mastered it. Kale whispered that they had built all of this without destroying their world. Helios confirmed population scale readings in the billions. This was not a colony. It was a home world. Then the probe alarms activated. A vessel had appeared from orbit around the fourth planet, sleek, white, and moving with controlled precision. It was unlike anything Chiron engineering had encountered. Its propulsion signature was clean, efficient, and deliberate. On its hull, glowing markings identified it as UNSC Valor. Kale instinctively asked for weapon status. Helios confirmed none were active. That fact unsettled them more than if weapons had been present. The ship was approaching, not attacking, not fleeing, but intercepting with purpose. A transmission followed, structured and intentional. Mathematical sequences formed first. Universal communication attempts designed for first contact. Helios immediately responded with their own version of the sequence, establishing acknowledgement. The human vessel reacted instantly, adapting the pattern, refining it, as if learning their language in real time. Helios froze at the implication that the response speed and adaptation suggested an intelligence capable of rapid linguistic assimilation. Then a voice came through the channel. Human. Calm. Controlled. A captain identified himself as Adrian Cole of the United Nations Space Command vessel Valor. He stated clearly that the probe was entering protected space and requested identification. Lyra transmitted their response carefully, explaining that they were the Chiron, survivors of a broken fleet with no hostile intent. The silence that followed was long enough to feel like judgment. Kale prepared for rejection or hostility, but instead the human voice returned with a single question. How many ships were involved? Helios answered honestly, stating 17 vessels and thousands of lives. Another pause followed, heavier than the first. And then the human captain simply said, Stand by. On the human ship, Captain Cole turned away from the console and issued immediate orders. Engineering, medical, and logistics teams were to prepare for deployment. His officers questioned the wisdom of acting without full intelligence on the alien species. But Cole dismissed hesitation with a single principle. They were alive, and that was enough. Within hours, human vessels began moving into formation. Not into combat positions, but protective ones. They positioned themselves between the unknown fleet and potential threats, forming a layered defensive barrier in space. From the Chiron perspective, it was incomprehensible. No species had ever willingly placed themselves in harm's way for strangers. Lyra asked the question directly. Why were they doing this? The answer came simply. Because they were stranded. That explanation did not satisfy logic, but it satisfied reality. Hours turned into days as human engineering ships approached damaged Chiron vessels. No demands were made. No conditions were set. Instead, repair teams boarded the alien ships and began stabilizing life support systems immediately. Medical personnel prioritized children and critical patients without hesitation. Supplies were distributed freely, and communication systems were upgraded faster than Chiron scientists believed possible. Officer Dren suspected a trap, but even he struggled to identify what benefit deception would bring in such a situation. Helios observed the data exchanges and quietly admitted that if the humans intended control, they already had it. Instead, they were improving survival conditions. On the hull of one of the Chiron ships, Kale observed a human engineer working on exposed systems. The human noticed him watching and simply raised a hand in greeting. Not a signal, not a protocol, just acknowledgement. Kale hesitated, then returned the gesture. That small exchange carried more emotional weight than any formal diplomatic communication. Meanwhile, deeper within the fleet, Commander Lyra watched the transformation unfold. For the first time since the evacuation, the fleet was no longer decaying in isolation. It was being stabilized, supported, helped, and something within her began to shift. Trust was still dangerous, but absence of help had proven far more lethal. The humans were not behaving like any known species in their historical records. They did not demand payment. They did not negotiate territory. They did not assert superiority. They simply acted. And in doing so, they changed the fundamental assumption the Chiron had carried across the stars, that survival was a solitary struggle. Days later, as systems stabilized and the fleet regained minimal operational capacity, Lyra stood on the observation deck of Erebus Hope, watching human ships move in synchronized coordination with her own engineers. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider a future that was not defined by escape or extinction. Helios joined her quietly and said that if this was deception, it was the most inefficient one in recorded history. Lyra replied that perhaps not all inefficiency was irrational. Perhaps some of it was intentional. Somewhere beyond the hull, children who had never seen a real sky were learning that survival did not always mean isolation. And in the silence between stars, two civilizations that had never known each other were beginning something neither had a word for yet, but both would eventually recognize as the same thing: hope shared between strangers. The first wave of repairs had barely stabilized the Chiron fleet when the anomaly arrived without warning. It was not a ship, not a weapon in the conventional sense, but a distortion in space itself, rippling across sensor grids like a silent scream. The human engineers were the first to notice it. On the UNSC Valor, alarms triggered across multiple systems as Captain Adrian Cole stepped into the bridge, his expression tightening at the readings. Something massive was approaching the system boundary, and it was not natural. Science Officer Hale identified it as a cascading gravitational instability, likely the residual effect of whatever event had shattered the Chiron faster-than-light core in the first place. But this time it was closer, stronger, and collapsing inward toward the fleet's position. Cole didn't hesitate. All ships, defensive posture. Move civilian vessels behind the planetary shadow if possible. Lyra Venn felt the update arrive through the shared communication relay, and for a moment she did not process the words. Another collapse event meant death for ships already weakened. The Chiron fleet had no strength left for another crisis. Life support systems were still being rebuilt. Propulsion was only partially restored. Many vessels could barely maintain orbit, and now space itself was turning hostile again. On the bridge of Erebus Hope, officers moved in controlled panic. Dren reported structural strain across multiple hulls. Helios confirmed that the anomaly was expanding faster than prediction models could adapt. It was not simply approaching, it was accelerating toward them. Lyra ordered immediate evacuation protocols for non-essential sections, but even as she spoke, she knew it would not be enough. There was nowhere left to run. Then the humans acted. Without further debate, UNSC engineering vessels detached from formation and moved directly toward the expanding gravitational distortion. Shields flared as they crossed into unstable space. The Chiron officers watched in disbelief as human ships deliberately positioned themselves between the anomaly and the vulnerable fleet. It was not a tactical retreat. It was interception. Cole's voice came through the shared channel, steady despite rising interference. We're going to try to dampen the field using synchronized energy discharge. It won't stop it completely, but it may reduce the wave collapse long enough for evacuation. Lyra stared at the transmission as if it made no sense. Your ships will be destroyed, Cole replied simply. Then we'll build more. For a moment, no one spoke. That sentence carried no drama, no heroism in tone. It was stated as fact, as if sacrifice was not extraordinary, but procedural when lives were at stake. Chiron officers exchanged stunned looks. This was not logic they recognized. Survival for their species had always meant preservation of self above all else. But the humans were operating on a different equation entirely. Across the system, human ships began coordinated energy alignment. Their reactors surged into synchronized output patterns, forming a stabilizing lattice across space. The gravitational anomaly reacted violently, pulling at the field like a living force. Entire sections of space warped under pressure. Two smaller human vessels reported structural stress beyond safe limits. They did not withdraw. Instead, they reinforced output. On the Chiron fleet, evacuation efforts intensified. Shuttles moved continuously between crippled ships, transferring children, injured crew, and critical personnel to the more stable vessels. Dr. Elira, from the human medical team, refused to leave the nursery transport until every Chiron child was safely relocated. When ordered to retreat, she simply replied that there was still room on the next shuttle. Kale Rin, now working alongside human pilots, watched as one of the outer Chiron ships began to fracture under gravitational strain. He requested permission to assist in evacuation. When granted, he flew directly into collapsing debris fields, extracting survivors under conditions no simulation would have considered survivable. Later, when asked why he took the risk, he responded that there was no alternative that preserved everyone. Elios Ma, monitoring system collapse, began to understand something fundamental shifting in real time. The humans were not calculating acceptable losses in the way Chiron's strategic models always did. They were attempting to eliminate the concept entirely. Their planning assumed survival of all units, not optimization of survival probability. It was inefficient. It was irrational. And yet it was working. The gravitational anomaly reached critical expansion. Entire sections of space bent inward like breaking glass. One human vessel, Horizon Relay, lost primary shielding and began structural failure. Captain Cole ordered its crew to abandon ship, but the crew refused, maintaining energy output, until evacuation of adjacent Chiron ships was complete. Only when the last shuttle cleared did they disengage, and by then the vessel was already collapsing into the distortion field. The Chiron watched that moment in silence. There was no broadcast of fear, no final message of regret, only confirmation of mission completion before contact was lost. Lyra's voice broke for the first time since the crisis began. "They are still inside the field," Cole responded immediately. "We know." "Then why are you still holding position?" A pause. Then, "Because your ships are not." The field destabilized further, but the human energy lattice had done its work. The collapse wave slowed, just enough for remaining Chiron vessels to clear the danger zone. One by one, damaged ships limped towards safer orbit behind the planetary shadow, guided by human coordination. The UNC Valor remained at the center of the stabilization grid until the last evacuation signal confirmed success. Only then did Cole order full withdrawal. When the anomaly finally dissipated, the cost became visible. 3 human ships were gone. 17 more were heavily damaged, but every Chiron vessel remained intact. Not a single civilian ship had been lost. On the bridge of Erebus Hope, silence stretched for a long time after confirmation. Dren eventually asked what the human casualties were. No one answered immediately, because Elios was still processing the final data stream. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. They stayed until the end. Lyra closed her eyes. For the first time since leaving her home system, she felt something unfamiliar settling in her chest. Not hope exactly, something heavier, something earned. A direct channel opened from the Valor. Captain Cole's voice was strained now, but steady. "Fleet Commander Venn, anomaly is cleared. You're stable. We'll assist with repairs when we recover." Lyra hesitated before responding. "You lost ships?" "Yes. Why?" Cole was silent for a moment before answering. "Because you were going to lose yours." That sentence did not feel like explanation. It felt like worldview. In the days that followed, the human fleet withdrew slightly to conduct emergency repairs. The Chiron began full recovery operations, but the psychological shift was irreversible. Children who had only known metal corridors now spoke of ships that had protected them without asking anything in return. Engineers who had once viewed alien contact as strategic risk now worked alongside human counterparts without suspicion. Even Dren, once the most cautious officer aboard, no longer referred to humans as unpredictable. He called them consistent. Elios compiled his final assessment and presented it privately to Lyra. His conclusion was simple. If the humans had intended control, they had already been given opportunity. If they had intended exploitation, the Chiron were already vulnerable enough to accept it. Instead, every action taken by the humans prioritized Chiron's survival over their own material security. Lyra asked the only question that remained. What do they gain from this? Helios paused. I don't think that is the correct question anymore. Then what is? He looked toward the viewport, where distant human ships were still visible against the stars. What kind of species becomes like this? Weeks later, full repairs allowed limited travel restoration. The fleet and human vessels moved together toward a habitable system identified earlier by joint scans. It was a world rich in resources, stable in orbit, and capable of supporting both species. When they finally entered orbit, the sight of the planet brought something close to disbelief across Chiron crews. It was not a temporary refuge. It was a future. As settlement preparations began, Lyra stood once more beside Captain Cole. The fleet was no longer a drifting graveyard. It was becoming something else, a colony in motion, a shared beginning. She finally spoke after a long silence. We recorded your losses. Cole nodded slightly. So did we. Lyra turned toward him. And still you came with us. Cole looked out at the planet below. That's what we do. Lyra studied him for a moment, then said quietly, No, that is what you choose to do. For the first time, Cole did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice carried something softer. Then maybe it's time your people chose it too. Below them, the first joint human-Chiron landing craft began descent toward the new world. A world that would not belong to one species or the other, but to the choice they had made together in the dark between stars. And far behind them, in the empty silence of space, the memory of what humans had done began spreading further than any signal ever could. Not as conquest, not as warning, but as proof that somewhere in the galaxy there existed a species that did not measure survival by what it could take, but by what it was willing to save.